some work that was done together with Mark DeLucci of UC Davis, but I also had several other students. I had several students, Christine Archer, Lane Hart, Mike Dvorak, Eric Stoutenberg, Bethany Corcoran, and John Tenhove, who helped along with this. So if we can go to the first slide. Actually, Fernando, I don't have power on to control the slides here. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Something happens. Let me make
I
you.
I think I did because I changed computers. Sorry. And that's so I was logged on twice maybe.
Yeah. One moment. Should be okay now.
There we go. Okay. Okay. So, well, first of all, why are we doing this? Because we could, certainly burn coal and gas and oil for at least decades, if not more. Well, temperatures are rising rapidly. Arctic sea ice is dwindling quickly. Air pollution mortality is one of the 5 leading causes of death, and like 2.5 to 3 million people die per year prematurely from air pollution. And higher population and growing energy demand will result in worse air pollution and climate over time. So I want to just motivate this really quickly by some of the climate and air pollution issues that I think are important, just because otherwise it might not seem that there is an urgency to do something quickly. So just, you've probably all seen something like this. This is the temperature record recently from 1880 at least. And it shows that the temperatures are rising rapidly. The point I want to make here, first of all, 2 points, is one, 9 out of the 10 warmest years on record are in the last 10 years. And the rate of change of temperature is faster than any time, basically, in human history. There have been warmer temperatures on record in 100 million years ago, and certainly the Hadean period 4 billion years ago when the Earth was molten. 100 million years ago, the Earth was ice-free, but nobody lived back then. So the higher temperatures back then are not really relevant to civilization with 7 billion people and growing. So that's one of the motivations, the rate of change of temperature today. And that's resulting in the reduction of Arctic sea ice, rapid reduction, about 10% since 1979 at least. And this is a concern because of the fast climate response to a changing albedo of the Arctic Ocean. Since the ice albedo is about 60% and the ocean albedo is about 5 to 8%. So if you uncover the ocean, then you can get much more rapid warming, and that could trigger faster warming of the north and more melting. And in the ice caps of the world, and including the Antarctic, which you have most of it, there are about 70 meters of sea level stored, and the loss of 70 meters of ice would translate into higher sea levels of about 70 meters, and that would result in about 7% of all the world's land being covered over with water. And most people live on the coastline, so that would cause quite a bit of devastation. Now, in terms of air pollution, as I mentioned, 2.5 to 3 million people die per year prematurely. And in North America and Europe, things have gotten a little bit better, but most of the rest of the world is much worse. I'm just going to show you a few photographs. Here's Norilsk, Russia, Sukinda, India, Linfen, China. China has 16 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world. And the air pollution causes significant mortality. The Asian brown cloud over China, and this also occurs over India and most of Southeast Asia, contributes not only to health problems. This cloud that's being shown is pollution, except for the white clouds are real clouds. The brown stuff is all pollution. This contributes to global warming, this brown cloud, these aerosol particles. Black carbon and also brown carbon are both warming agents in the atmosphere, and they evaporate clouds. So you'll notice in that brown cloud region there are hardly any real clouds. And those contribute not only to health problems but also to significant warming. And this is a severe problem, and so we need to act quickly. And one more slide with regard to health and pollution. This shows the lungs of a non-smoker from Los Angeles in the 1970s. And there's a teenager, actually. And just indicating that living in a polluted city is like smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Every 10 micrograms per meter cubed of particulate matter in the air reduces a person's life about 5 to 10 months. And in the U.S., about 50 to 100,000 people die prematurely each year, about 18,000 in California. In Europe, it's about 330,000 per year. This is mostly outdoor air pollution. And indoor air pollution in developing countries is even a much worse problem. Okay, so these are the motivation why I'm interested in solving these problems. So let's look at the energy solutions. So the first step was to try to rank energy technologies. So look at proposed energy technologies and then rank them in terms of several environmental and reliability factors, not looking at costs at first. So just so we can find out, well, what are the best technologies and what are technologies that have been proposed that are not so good. So we'll look at them in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, air pollution mortality, their water consumption, their footprint on the ground, and the total spacing required between them, because there is a difference between footprint and spacing, the resource abundance, and the ability to match peak demand, and actually a few other factors that are not listed. But then, after obtaining kind of the best technologies, we want to evaluate whether it's feasible to replace 100% of all energy worldwide for all purposes with these technologies, and again look at resources, but also materials, matching supply with demand, costs now, and politics. So, what are the technologies we want to look at? Well, first, in the electricity sector, wind turbines. I'm sorry if this didn't seem to come out very well, but it's wind turbines, solar photovoltaics, concentrated solar power, geothermal power plants, tidal turbines, wave devices, hydroelectric power plants, nuclear power plants, coal with carbon capture and sequestration. And there are certainly other technologies that I can discuss and tell you how they fit in compared with these other ones, but these are the ones we analyzed. And then in terms of vehicles, battery electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, then some biofuel vehicles, corn ethanol, cellulosic ethanol. We also are analyzing the ability to do this not only for vehicles and electricity, but also for commercial and industrial processes, home heating and cooling, and for and even aircraft, and just pretty much covering all energy technologies of any kind. So next slide, we're just a brief photo gallery of some of these technologies. I won't say much about them. Wind turbines, I just want to point out the spacing between them. Wave devices take the up and down motion of the waves and convert it into electric power, transmitted to shore. Hydroelectric power, taking the gravitational drainage of water from from a dam to convert it into electric power, geothermal power, taking hot water or rocks from under the ground and passing water over it to evaporate the water to then drive a turbine. And tidal turbines, which are basically wind turbines under the ground, under the water. Concentrated solar power, where you focus light on mirrors. In this case, the mirrors focus on a centralized tower that you heat a fluid, and the fluid then passes by water that heats the water to evaporate it to drive a turbine. The nice thing about concentrated solar is you can store the heat overnight and then release it at night. Then solar photovoltaic power plants, so large arrays of solar photovoltaics, and also rooftop solar power. And then for vehicles, electric vehicles, the top row are existing electric vehicles. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. On the bottom there's a hydrogen fuel cell bus. Then there's also an electric truck, and then a hydrogen electric bus hybrid. And so we're looking at technologies that exist today or are really close to existence, as opposed to technologies that might exist in 20 years. And the reason for that is because it is urgent to do something at this time. So we have to rely only on things that we know will work and know exist today. So this is why we're not looking at some proposed technologies that actually don't have really we don't have any knowledge of whether they will be available soon. And also here's examples of a hydrogen fuel cell ship that exists, an electric ship that exists, hydrogen fuel cell tractor drawing, and also this is one that doesn't quite exist, well, doesn't exist, but has been studied quite a bit, hydrogen airplane using cryogenic hydrogen or liquefied hydrogen. It does exist, though, in a space shuttle. The space shuttle uses liquefied hydrogen to run. For homes, an air source heat pump, air source heat pump water heater, then a rooftop solar hot water heater. These are some examples. And the air source heat pumps, which are really efficient, can be used in reverse for air conditioning. Okay, so let's then, we did an analysis first to compare these different technologies in terms of their life cycle CO2 emissions. And actually, we didn't do the life cycle emission counting ourselves. We just looked at the literature and obtained numbers from the literature. And for each of these technologies that are listed here, we have a low and a high estimate. So let's start actually on the right with coal CCS, coal with carbon capture and sequestration. So the carbon capture equipment reduces about 85 to 90% of the CO2 emitted from the smokestack, but it does not reduce the emissions from the mining or the transport of the coal. So as a result, you actually still have quite a bit of emissions from coal with carbon capture. In addition, you need about 25% more energy to use the equipment, so you need 25% more coal mining and transport. And so a regular coal plant emits about 900 to 1,000 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour from the stack, and another maybe 300 or 400 upstream. So this does represent a reduction compared to regular coal, but is not, as you can see, not so low as the other technologies. Natural gas would fall basically above the red line for coal, the higher estimate, or around the high estimate. So it's kind of on that order. Nuclear power, the two estimates represent, the low estimate represents the nuclear energy industry estimate, and the high estimate is from a set of 2 review studies that looked at each 100 studies of life cycle analyses of nuclear power. And so, but both are put in for fairness. But there is, I do want to point out, there is a difference between what the nuclear energy industry thinks of what they're emitting and what scientists are thinking in terms of the average emissions. Now, the life cycle emissions are really the emissions from the building of a plant and operating it during its life and decommissioning it or refurbishing it. And so they don't represent all the emissions as I'll discuss. There's another set of emissions that we'll discuss in a few minutes. But back to this graph, for hydroelectric, the dams can last quite a long time. And so even though there's a huge amount of energy put in initially to build a dam, because you're amortizing it over a long period of time, the grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour generated are relatively low. For tidal wave, there's not a lot of information, and certainly technologies are changing, so this just represents results from 1 or 2 studies that had done some analysis. Geothermal, the difference represents the 2 different types of geothermal plants. On the low numbers from a binary plant and the high number from a non-binary plant. The binary plant does not allow the water that passes over the rocks from under the ground to be exposed to the atmosphere, where it would evaporate carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the water. The non-binary plants, you would get evaporation of CO2, and that's why you have higher CO2 emissions. About 13% of all plants worldwide are binary, and the rest are non-binary. Solar PV, there's a range depending on latitude and solar intensity, and also it represents an improvement actually over several years ago, where solar CO2 emissions were even higher due to the intensity of producing solar cells. With CSP, that's low, and so is wind. And the wind, this is assuming you're in wind locations of 7 meters per second to 8.5 meters per second winds. So you wouldn't, if you have slower wind speeds, the CO2 emissions would be higher per kilowatt hour. But we do not recommend putting wind turbines in anywhere lower than 7 meters a second winds. And the mapping of the world's winds that we've done, we found that about 15% of the world's lands worldwide have winds 7 meters a second or faster. I'll show you some of the maps later. So there's another type of emissions associated with these technologies. That's emissions associated with the time lag between planning and operation. Because some technologies take longer to plan between planning and operation than others, you will require the background electric power grid to run while we're waiting to put those technologies up compared to others. So nuclear power, for example, it takes 10 to 19 years between planning and operation. That includes, well, in the U.S., it's about 3.5 to 6 years for a site permit. Construction permit approval and issue is 2.5 to 4 years, and construction time is 4 to 9 years. And most recently, in the last 5 years, the average construction time alone has been, on average, between 6 and 7 years. So this is right in the middle of these numbers. So it takes a while compared to wind, wave power, solar PV, concentrated solar, and even ethanol. About 2 to 5 years to put up a plant between planning and operation. You can obviously find exceptions to all these, but this is typical. And the hydroelectric, it takes a long time as well, but the lifetime is about 80 years. By the way, these lifetimes are the times before you might refurbish the plant. It doesn't mean you're necessarily deconstructing the plant after the lifetime. We're going to look over a 100-year period, for example, and after one lifetime, you might refurbish the plant. It might take 2 or 3 years to refurbish it. in which case you'll have to be emitting the background electric power grid. Coal with CCS, well, we don't actually have that at a commercial scale. We only have regular coal, and regular coal takes about 6 to 11 years. So coal with CCS probably takes longer, but so this is probably conservative. Geothermal is about 3 to 6 years. So the impact of this for each energy technology shown on this slide, which shows the additional grams of CO2 emitted per kilowatt hour generated due to the planning to operation delays for each technology relative to wind or any of the other technologies that has a lower time between planning and operation. So we're going to add these numbers to the previous numbers, and we get this plot that shows kind of more separation in the grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour for each technology. And you can see nuclear, especially the kind of the scientific estimate, and coal with carbon capture are starting to look a little different than these other ones. Clearly, nuclear is not carbon-free. If it's emitting up to 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, almost compared to wind or concentrated solar power. Now, the next thing we want to look at is put this on a par with ethanol vehicles, corn and cellulosic. So to do this, we're going to look at converting all the vehicles in the United States to either battery electric, hydrogen fuel cell, or corn or cellulosic ethanol, and look at the CO2 emissions changes. Now, in the United States, 24% of all CO2 emissions come from the vehicle exhaust, and about 7% from the upstream production of the fuel. Sorry, 26% from the vehicle exhaust. So the total CO2 emissions is about 33% of all the CO2. So the maximum reduction you can get if you convert to a clean energy technology is 33% reduction in CO2. So what this shows excuse me, is that wind powering battery electric vehicles reduces almost 33%, about 32.5% or so. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles powered by wind, they require about 3 times more wind turbines than battery electrics because the efficiency of a battery electric vehicle is so great. It's between 75 and 86% from plug to wheel. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, when you account for the compression of the hydrogen and the electrolysis and the fuel cell itself, it's about 28 to 30% efficiency. But that's still better than internal combustion, which is on the order of 17 to 20% on the fleet average. So the point is that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, although they'll be very clean, hardly emit anything, just water vapor. If you're using wind to produce the hydrogen, they will still require more turbines than the battery electric. As a result, because of the CO2 emissions from the turbine manufacturing, you'll have slightly more CO2 emissions associated with wind hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. For concentrated solar power, you get a really good benefit, good reduction. And most of these others are really good as well. With nuclear and coal with carbon capture, you start getting some separation. But now we can look at corn ethanol, and corn ethanol is either going to just slightly reduce CO2 emissions compared to gasoline, or you could actually increase them quite a bit. So the low number in the case of corn ethanol accounts for is based on detailed life cycle analysis done at UC Davis. And the high number is, but that one did not account for land use change. The high number accounts for land use change. And so there's some controversy about whether there's a feedback to prices and the consumption of land, conversion of land in other parts of the world when you use corn for fuel instead of food. There's controversy, but so you can pick your number somewhere between this range. So, but this is pretty much the range of the CO2 emissions that would result from corn ethanol. Cellulosic ethanol, you can get up to a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions compared to gasoline per vehicle if you do not account for land use change. If you do, then you can actually get a 50% increase per vehicle. So that again, there's a big range. But the point is, neither cellulosic nor corn ethanol are coming close to battery electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. It's totally a different ball game. And the point is that the comparisons are always these biofuel vehicles versus gasoline or diesel. However, that's not the correct comparison. The correct comparison is with battery electrics or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, since it is clear once you do that comparison, you can see there's no competition among them. The problem is combustion. Combustion is so inefficient compared to electricity or even hydrogen that you're going to get negative disbenefits when you compare using battery electrics or hydrogen versus the biofuels. Now let's look at the air pollution health problems, and it gets worse here for the biofuels. If you look at in the U.S., the number of deaths per year from internal combustion today, just from the vehicles, is about 20 to 25,000. If we go to 2020, upon further improvements of vehicle technologies, it'll be about 15,000. This is just from the vehicle fleet for gasoline. So if we do a conversion of corn ethanol or cellulosic ethanol vehicles, we would actually have about the same or a slight increase in the death rates. With cellulosic, it's even slightly higher than with corn ethanol. And that's, well, first of all, this was based on, we did these really detailed simulations, still the only simulations that have ever been done on this, actually accounting for the emissions in full atmospheric chemistry and all the aerosol microphysics and chemistry and cloud processes to look at what's the effect of converting all the vehicles in the United States to ethanol fueled vehicles, and did a calculation, found that in the United States on average there is about a 4% increase in the mortality due to ozone alone due to converting to ethanol vehicles. Most of this was in places like Los Angeles and also the East Coast, where in Los Angeles there was a 9% increase, but there was a decrease in the southeast U.S. Due to the fact that, well, it's chemical interactions related to the fact that you have lots more organics in the southeast, and so you're in a low, you have a low ratio of NOx to organics there, and in that case, when you convert to ethanol vehicles, which the ethanol vehicles put out more organics but less NOx, in that situation you can decrease ozone. In Los Angeles, the higher organics and less NOx both increase ozone. Anyway, there's so the tailpipe emissions result in about 4% increased deaths, but then the upstream emissions from cellulosic ethanol are actually higher than from corn ethanol, and that results in slightly higher overall deaths. But they're all pretty close to gasoline. Again, when the ethanol industry compares with gasoline, they all often say that their product reduces their pollution, but in fact that's not true. But that's actually not even relevant either. It shouldn't be a comparison of gasoline versus ethanol. It should really be a comparison of ethanol versus these other technologies, which you can see clearly have almost eliminate air pollution, mortality. Coal with carbon capture and nuclear, you can see they're slightly they're not quite so good as the other ones, but they're still much better than corn and cellulosic ethanol. Now, if we consider nuclear the weapons proliferation risk. With nuclear, the problem with it, aside from nuclear meltdowns, is where 2% of all nuclear reactors to date have melted down to some degree, is that at least 5 countries have developed nuclear weapons capabilities secretly in nuclear energy facilities. And these include Iraq before 1982, Pakistan, India, and Iran, and to some degree North Korea, although North Korea also was developing in other ways. But if we expand nuclear power on a large scale, the risk is that other countries will start to develop the capabilities for weapons, and if just one weapon is used in a megacity of 1 to 16 million people, this yellow bar indicates the number of deaths scaled to the U.S. population. If this is just one bomb in 30 years, the number of deaths associated with nuclear power would be that yellow bar. So you can suggest the risk is somewhere between 0 and 1. We don't know what that risk is exactly, but it is a risk. These other technologies do not have that risk associated with it. So there are the risks associated not only with the weapons proliferation, but also the meltdowns and also dealing with the waste that you don't have to deal with these other technologies. Okay, so let's move on to the footprints versus the spacing. Wind, okay, the footprint is actually almost trivial with regard to wind. The footprint is actually the land being touched on the ground by a given energy technology, not even below the ground, because we're really interested in other land uses and what can be put on the land. So in this case, you can see you can use the land around a wind turbine for agricultural or open space, or it could be just rangeland or wildlife land, or if it's over the ocean, it's just open ocean, and you're not taking up any land. Now the spacing area, which many people often confuse with the footprint, they call it the footprint, but they're really referring to the spacing. You do need to separate turbines to prevent interference from the wakes of one turbine with another turbine. And so we'll look at those two numbers separately. Just to give you an idea, the footprint area required for wind to power the entire U.S. vehicle fleet, well, we would need to power the U.S. vehicle fleet, we would need between 73,000 and 140,000 5-megawatt wind turbines, and the footprint would be 1 to 3 square kilometers. The spacing area would be about 0.5% of the United States. So the footprint, though, I'll show you a map of in a minute. If we compare with like nuclear power, the footprint it's not large actually compared to some other footprints, but it's a different type of footprint. You can see there's a lot more concrete touching the ground, and there's uranium mining that takes up some space. So let's look at a map of the U.S. and really put this in context. If we use cellulosic ethanol, there's the areas required. Well, there's an estimated range between 5 and 35% of the United States land area to run all the U.S. on-road vehicles. That includes the area, when I say 5 to 35%, that includes Alaska. Now, why is there a big range here? Well, the low estimate is the ethanol industry estimate, and the high estimate is really from some scientific studies that actually looked at real, I think, miscanthus or other types of, or switchgrass growths. So there is a range, and there is uncertainty. With corn ethanol, the range is lower. It's between, of uncertainty is 10% to 18%, but still both very large areas. Now, nuclear, it would be a relatively small area. It's about the size of Rhode Island. You do need space around the nuclear plants, so there is this buffer space in addition to the actual footprint, so there is some spacing associated with it. With wind, again, it's a very small footprint, the smallest of all technologies, the red dot in the middle, and then the white is the spacing, the area required to run all the U.S. Vehicles. So about 0.5% of the U.S. for the spacing. But of course, this could go a lot over the ocean too, so it doesn't necessarily have to require a lot of footprint. For geothermal, the footprint and the spacing are pretty much the same, and it's got the lowest total spacing of the technologies, very little. In solar, it has the lower spacing than, well, again, the footprint and the spacing for solar are pretty close to each other. The spacing is lower for solar than for wind, but the footprint is higher. But again, it's not a huge area, certainly compared to corn and cellulosic ethanol. So on spacing grounds and footprint grounds, there's no reason not to use huge amounts of wind and solar. And I'll give you some numbers for the total land area required to power the world for all purposes in a little later. Okay, and now we've done some mapping of the East Coast offshore winds, and these are the most recent map. That kind of gives you an idea of how much power is out there, because you can actually power most of the United States just with high wind offshore locations off the East Coast. So in areas where the wind speeds offshore are 8.8 to 9.9 meters per second, and by the way, you could use, as I mentioned, down to 7 meters per second, although offshore is more expensive, so you might want to only use 7.5 meters to 8 meters a second. But just in locations where you have 8.8 to 9.9 meters per second winds, where the capacity factors are greater than 45%, and excluding one-third of these areas, you can get 173 gigawatts of power in regions where the depth is 200 meters or less. That compares with a U.S. electricity demand of 454 gigawatts. So about 40% of power could be obtained just from the fast wind locations offshore, which is a significant amount. And so there are plans to put this big transmission infrastructure offshore, so that might help in getting some of those winds realized. Now, if we look at the water consumption of these different technologies, and again, we're talking about converting the fleet to U.S. in the U.S. to either electric or hydrogen or ethanol. Most technologies don't take up a lot of water. You can see the ethanol vehicles do take about 13% of all corn in the U.S. is irrigated, and so if we used corn ethanol to power all vehicles in the U.S., that would take up about 10% of the U.S. water supply. Cellulosic ethanol would be less, maybe half that. Hydroelectric takes up a lot of water because of the evaporation of water from the surface of the dams. Nuclear and coal with carbon capture, they would take up water because they're thermal power plants. Now, concentrated solar it may take up water if you're going to use water cooling. However, you can use dry air cooling, in which case the water goes down to almost zero, but you lose efficiency of about, I think it was cost of efficiency. So based on this analysis, we came up with a ranking of the technologies and recommended some of them. So we want to recommend what are the best ones, and the ones that are not recommended are not necessarily, they're not they're not worse necessarily than what we have today, although in cases of ethanol, they can be worse. But they're just not so good as these other technologies. So wind, concentrated solar, geothermal, tidal, photovoltaics, wave, and hydroelectricity were recommended. And hydroelectricity is included, even though it does have issues with it. As we'll see, it's incredibly good for helping to match supply with demand, and there are very, very low CO2 or air pollution emissions associated with it. The problems with it are, of course, there's a lot of water use associated with it, or water evaporation associated with it. And also, there's, a lot of people don't like to dam rivers. But the benefits of hydroelectricity are so significant, and it's almost necessary to help balance the loads, as we'll see, that it's definitely a recommended option here. For vehicles, battery electrics, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So what's not recommended are nuclear, coal with carbon capture and sequestration, because nuclear, even though the emissions are not huge, there are just so many risks that are unnecessary to take with it, and that compared with these other technologies, that there's really no need for it, given that the other technologies, there's so much resource for solar and wind that we just don't need nuclear for this plan. Coal with carbon capture, the emissions are too high, and there's too much, and it doesn't even exist, so it really doesn't exist at the commercial scale. Natural gas, higher emissions than coal with carbon capture, are about the same or higher. Burning of biomass, again, you have combustion, so you have air pollution emissions, and so it's not going to be nearly so efficient as any of the wind, water, and sun options in terms of reducing air pollution. Even if the CO2 emissions are relatively low compared to other options. Corn, cellulosic ethanol. Well, cellulosic is about as good as you can get with ethanol. Sugarcane is biodiesel. They have similar problems, especially if you look at the real life cycle analysis of soy biodiesel. Algae biodiesel, you're still going to be burning it and producing air pollution. Maybe better CO2 emissions than soy, but still not so good as these other technologies. Compressed natural gas, similar to regular natural gas. The point is, a lot of these technologies that are not recommended, they may be better than what we have today, but they're not so good as what we could have. And given the limited budgets, we really need to go for the best technologies, not technologies that are somewhere in between. So can we use these technologies to power the entire world? Well, the end-use power demand in 2010 was 12.5 terawatts. In 2030, the estimated power demand will be about 17 terawatts. The end-use power demand, if we convert to wind, water, and sun with electricity and hydrogen, will be about 11.5 terawatts. And that's because electricity is so efficient. As I mentioned before, with vehicles, using an electric vehicle, you have 75 to 86% efficiency from plug to wheel. And that reduces your power demand. It also reduces your cost. The cost of running an electric car, not the purchase of the car, but just the running of the car from house is on the order in the United States of $1 per gallon equivalent gasoline, compared with the cost of gasoline of $4 a gallon. So it's 1/4 the cost to run your vehicle with electricity than it is with gasoline. So, but the efficiency is really an improvement here, that you can get a 30% reduction in the overall world power demand by moving everything to electricity and hydrogen. And this is the details of this are described in this the energy policy papers that Mark DeLucci and I worked on, and are probably will be referenced at the end. Now, sorry that this slide is a little messed up, but this is just one 2030. You can have, in one scenario, you'd use 50% wind and 40% solar and 10% everything else. And the reason for this distribution is that wind and solar, as I'll show in a couple slides, are the only resources that can be used to power the entire world on their own individually. In fact, for wind, you can power the entire world 5 to 10 times over with just wind resources over the land at high wind locations. And for solar, it's about 20 times over for solar over land and high solar locations. But the cost of wind is lower than the cost of solar right now, so that's why there's more wind than solar. But the amount of solar is pretty close to the amount of wind here, because, as we'll see, we'll want to use wind and solar together to be able to match power supply with demand pretty readily. And now the other technologies, we're not going to add much hydroelectric. So we're assuming 70% of all the hydroelectric is in place, and the hydro would take up 4% of, would supply 4% of all the world's power for all purposes. Geothermal, we also want 4%, and of the only 1.7% of that 4% is in place right now. And for wave and tidal, probably only 1% each. But for solar, we'll divide that into 3 types of solar. Concentrated solar plants would provide 20% of the world's power, 14% for solar PV plants would provide 40% of the power, and rooftop systems about 6%. And so those rooftop systems, that represents 1.7 billion 3-kilowatt systems. A typical residence is around 3 kilowatts, and so we need 1.7 billion of those to just supply 6% of the power. Certainly, if we had more solar rooftop systems, that would be great. And then we'd need less of other things. So this is just in 2005 we produced actually still the only world wind map from data alone at the height of modern turbines, and that estimated about 72 terawatts of power over land of wind. And this shows a modeled map, recent model map that we produced that it fills in the gaps, because the data map has spots where there are actual data around 9,000 stations, but this actually fills in the whole world and all the gaps between the stations. So we estimate between 70 to 170 terawatts based on this more complete fast wind locations. Worldwide, there are about 1,700 terawatts of wind, but of course, that's mostly in like the roaring 40s over the southern latitudes over the ocean where you can't extract it. But we only need 17 terawatts, or really 11.5 terawatts. So we have plenty of wind to power the entire world. And you can see where the winds are fast, primarily in the Great Plains in the U.S., offshore the East Coast and West Coast U.S., Northern Europe, the Sahara, Australia has really good winds. The winds are not so good in the tropics. Over a lot of Brazil and Central Africa, you don't have really good winds. But there are many places where the winds are good. The next map is a solar map showing that you have even more solar available than wind, 340 terawatts in high solar locations. So you can, in the southeast United States, again, the Sahara Desert, southern Europe, so as you can see, it'll really be combining resources, renewable energy resources, that will it'll really be the optimal solution. So this gets me to addressing variability. One of the criticisms of these renewable resources is they are intermittent. So how do you address the variability or intermittency of wind, water, and solar resources? Well, first, the resources that are intermittent are primarily the solar and the wind. Tidal power is not so intermittent. It's actually you can use it possibly as base load because of the regular nature of the tides. And also hydroelectricity could be used either as base load or as gap filling, and depending on certainly a season and other variables. Geothermal is generally used as base load power. Wave power would be intermittent like wind. But one way to first reduce the variability, there's 6 ways here. Just go through them very fast. I want to then focus on number 2. Interconnecting geographically dispersed wind, water, and sun resources. So, for example, with one wind farm, you have a lot of intermittency, but if you interconnect 3 wind farms or 7 or 8 wind farms through the transmission grid, and these wind farms are within 250 to 300 kilometers from each other, then you can make the wind farms more reliable. In fact, because you just over a 300 kilometer radius area, you converted a resource that was completely intermittent into one that was one-third the reliability of a coal-fired power plant, which was down 12.5% of the hours of the year. Half of that due to unplanned maintenance and half due to planned maintenance. Well, bundling wind, water, and sun resources as one commodity and using hydroelectricity to fill in the gaps in supply, that actually can help you match the peaks in power demand. And I'll show you an example in the next slide, so I won't say anything more about it on this page. Certainly using demand response management to reduce peaks, which is done already, but can be done more significantly, can help to reduce, help match supply with demand. So that's an incentive to, for example, a wastewater treatment plant to run at night instead of during peak afternoon hours, then the utility can control the demand better and help manage the grid. Now, oversizing peak generation capacity and producing hydrogen with the excess for other sectors is really, I think, an important possibility. So if you want to actually match the power demand better, one way to do this, well, and also supply energy for other sectors, one way to do this is actually oversize your wind and solar to improve the ability to make sure you're meeting the demand. But then on time, when you have extra electricity generated, which you'll do when you oversize, then use that to produce hydrogen, which we'll need for other sectors of the economy, energy sectors, in order to have a clean energy infrastructure. Another way is storing electric power on site, either on site in batteries or in battery electric vehicles, such as vehicle-to-grid. But with storage is probably the last thing we want to do because it's more expensive than some of these other options. And then forecasting winds and cloudiness better to reduce reserve requirements. This is something that is being worked on right now by a lot of groups. And it actually works by forecasting. You can forecast better and plan better, than you actually then can reduce the amount of reserves, in this case like natural gas reserves, that you need. And while the natural gas is not necessarily emitting very much when it's not actually being used very much in our scenario, when we have a large-scale penetration, if you don't have 100% renewables, you might have to be used as backup initially, and so you can reduce the backup requirements for natural gas and therefore reduce its emissions when it's in spinning reserve mode. Now, this is some work with wind, water, and sun for all purposes, and with in matching the hour-by-hour power demand. So the black line here, well, we looked for 2 years, 2005 and 2006, every hour, and this just shows 2 representative days. And the black line is the power demand on those 2 days. And we used existing around, just slightly higher than existing geothermal resources, which is the red. And we did not increase the hydroelectric resources available, so that's the darker blue. But we just increased wind and solar, and the orange is concentrated solar, so that's why you have a little bit at night where there's some storage being used. And the yellow is photovoltaics, and the light blue is wind. And on these two particular days, it shows that with the actual data, we used 5 locations for wind and several for solar where we had the real data. And we showed that if we did increase the capacities at these locations, that we could actually match power demand hour by hour. We found that we could actually deliver 99.8%, we can match it 99.8% of all hours over the 2-year period. So only 0.2% of the hours did we ever need natural gas, which is the gray, which was in spinning reserve mode in the background. And so that was without any demand response, without any oversizing, without any storage except for this concentrated solar power. So our next step is now looking at adding demand response, then looking at the oversizing to see if we can eliminate even that 0.2%. But the point is, it's really an optimization problem, and we don't think there's actually any reason that by combining these resources as one commodity, essentially, instead of thinking of wind as just a wind as wind on its own, as one commodity on its own, if we combine multiple renewable resources together and bundle them, that's really that's what can be used together to match power demand. .20% limit or 30% limit. But there is certainly, it takes a lot of organization. So in Europe, of course, there's the Desert Tech plan or program suggestion to do something similar where you combined wind and solar from the deserts through the transmission grid with wind and solar and other resources in mainland Europe, well, in Europe itself, and especially hydroelectric in the north and wind in the north. So really each region of the world, we'd want to do something similar where we look at the local resources and, well, the regional resources, really not just local, because the larger the area over which you can consider, the more efficient your overall system will be. So places like Australia, where you have lots of wind and solar and geothermal resources, as well as hydroelectric in Tasmania, that's one big system that you can consider combining wind, water, and sun. And you can see here in Europe and in North Africa, you can do a similar thing. In North America, you can do something similar. In parts of Asia, certainly it'll be harder in places where there's political instability and in places where there's not much existing infrastructure. But it's really looking at what are the regional resources available and then optimizing those to provide stable electric power. So using permanent magnets and wind turbines that people are concerned about. But there are 27.3 teragrams of neodymium available worldwide, and we'd only need about 4.4 to power the 50% of the entire world with wind, which is what we propose. And then at the end of those turbine lifetimes, that could be recycled. So we don't think that's the limit. In terms of lithium, well, the known lithium reserves are about 11 teragrams on land, and that would provide enough lithium for 1.1 billion vehicles. There are currently 800 million vehicles in the world. There are places like Argentina and Afghanistan which are known to have reserves. We just haven't quantified them yet, so there are additional sources there. And certainly the oceans have 240 teragrams of lithium, but it's more expensive to extract from the oceans. So at some point, recycling will probably be needed. But right now, this is not a limiting factor. It could be if nothing else is discovered or uncovered. Sorry about these slides. They look like they got jumbled up, but the costs, 2005 to 10 costs of this system versus 2020 to 30. Right now, onshore wind, geothermal, and hydroelectric are competitive with conventional electric power. For conventional electric power, which I have on the bottom, there's kind of the than that, but 7 cents a kilowatt hour is kind of the current number for the direct cost for conventional, plus another 5 for externalities, so around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. But offshore, well, the wind, geothermal, and onshore wind, geothermal and hydro are competitive. The others are more expensive, but are expected to come down by 2020 to 30 sufficiently that they'll all be competitive with the conventionals, especially when you account for the externality costs of the conventional electric power. For long distance transmission, there's for 1,200 to 2,000 kilometers, the cost can range, well, the median cost we estimate is 1.2 cents a kilowatt hour for this distance range, but there's a range of 0.3 to 3.2 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's just because you have to make assumptions about the lifetime of the transmission line, and there are different estimates of the cost of different types of lines, etc. But so 1.2 cents for long distance transmission would not overburden the cost of electric power for even remote wind or remote solar in, for example, the United States. So to summarize, we think the 2030 electric power cost will be 4 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour for most technologies and 8 to 13 for the rest, versus fossil fuels will be on the order of 13.5 cents for the total cost, including externalities. But again, that's a very conservative estimate of externalities. Long distance transmission there are a lot of local resources, be about 1 to 1.2 cents a kilowatt hour. The land area required for this overall plan, and this accounts for all these technologies, we would need about 0.4% of the world's land more for footprint and about another 0.6% for spacing. So a total of about 1% more of the world's land. This compares with about 40% of the world's land today is used for cropland and pasture. And this would also entail eliminating all the existing coal, oil, and gas infrastructure. So there would be actually a reduction of lands associated with those, although that's not included in this number. It would eliminate 2.5 to 3 million air pollution deaths per year, and it would eliminate global warming and provide energy and energy stability. Converting to the wind, water, and sun and electricity and hydrogen will also reduce power demand by 30%. There are several methods of reducing the variability problems associated with intermittent resources, and these are listed here. We don't think materials are limits, although recycling may be needed. There are barriers, including upfront cost, transmission needs, and the difficulty of siting and implementing transmission is probably the biggest barrier. There's obviously lobbying and politics, because the other energy technologies, their lobbyists will fight to the bitter end to prevent these large changes. And there's some information, lots of information actually at this website, including the papers that are the basis for this study that we're talking about. So with that, I guess I'll open up for questions, and I'm happy to answer as many as I can.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mark, for this very nice explanations and this in-depth analysis for how to figure out the future based on renewables, which, as it's shown, should be why not feasible. Okay, very well. So I invite you, Mark, to now focus on the Q&A window and then select the participants' view. I will be managing the rest of the session. So let me go through the first questions. So one moment. Okay, so one first consideration on water consumption. So water is not consumed in the sense
It's a good observation. Yeah, it's really recycled back into the air. So when I mean water consumption, what I'm referring to is the fact that it's not available for water supply anymore at the time, although certainly the water cycle, I mean, anything that evaporates back to the air eventually comes down as precipitation, but not necessarily back to the reservoir. So this is immediate. The evaporation is immediate loss from a reservoir that might be used for something else, and then to get that water back to the reservoir, it's well, not all that stuff that evaporates comes back. Some of it obviously does. So anyway, the point is well taken. It's not necessarily consumed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. There is another consideration on wind speeds, whether when deploying on large scale this wind plan, this might have an impact on well, the wind itself. So the question is whether the wind will slow down or will regain enough speed again to maintain a constant power supply worldwide. Well, I suppose that there is no problem.
Yes, so we did do a study on this issue, and we found that there's a reduction of the wind speed in the wake of a turbine, and that reduction can be up to like 60 or 70% of the wind speed. But what happens is the wind gets regenerated by the end of the wake. So the loss of wind speed is really local to the wake of the turbine. And so in our plan where we have 4 million turbines, about, if you look at the volumes of the wake compared to the volume of the atmosphere, it's such a trivial volume that it has less than a 0.1% effect on the world's winds, even less than that. In fact, so we have a paper that's on my website that can be obtained. If somebody wants to send me an email, I can point directly to it. But it's basically, if we power the entire world with wind, even 100%, it would be a trivial amount of wind loss. But there is certainly a local loss of the wind. But on the global scale, it's very small. Just to put it in perspective also, building greater effect on the wind than all the trees. In fact, air pollution also reduces the wind because it changes the stability of the atmosphere. It makes the air warmer aloft compared to the surface, and so that prevents fast winds from above the surface from coming to the surface, and that actually has a factor of 10 times higher effect on reducing the wind than just putting up all these wind turbines. So, so if you actually eliminate air pollution by using wind, you would actually then increase the winds associated with the current losses of wind due to air pollution.
Okay, very interesting topic. Thank you. There is another question on whether you have considered the costs and as well as CO2 emissions associated with the upgrading of the grid to accept these large numbers of small-scale and distributed power generation.
So I guess it's not referring to long-distance transmission, but for small-scale distributed power, so local transmission. The costs, the local transmission costs are included in the cost of energy numbers for all our technologies. It's just we did not include in the cost of energy numbers for all our technologies the cost of long-distance transmission, so that's why I separated that out. But the local transmission should be in there. But I don't have I don't have more information on. But you want to know about the CO2 emissions. The CO2 emissions associated with upgrading the grid. For the local, I mean, the short answer is no. We haven't looked specifically at the CO2 emissions, but we do assume that any grid changes for any new energy, whether we have wind or natural gas or coal for local transmission, we need to put up transmission lines, so there will be a CO2 cost associated with that. But I don't think it's very big because we're not talking about a lot of materials that are being produced.
Okay. Very well. There is another comment on the slide about time between planning and operation. Solar PV was shown to have a life of 40 years, and right now the warranty is only 25 years. So could you clarify this? Thank you.
I have to go back and look. 30. Actually, I have solar in my.
Yep.
Oh yeah, if I can go back to the slides for a second, just want to see what I wrote down. The third. I think the reason, if we can go to that slide. I'm not going back any faster. I think that for all those technologies that have longer lifetimes, there we go, longer lifetimes than we that we might have right now, or we might anticipate right now, it's because we don't know what those lifetimes are. Many wind turbines in Altamont Pass, for example, have been over 35 years. And so while solar photovoltaics, it's a similar thing. You know, the 25-year warranty is just because that's what people think will be the lifetime. But we don't.
It's here, actually.
Yeah, I see. Okay, life of 40 years. Actually, for photovoltaics, I think that lifetime. I think that only referred to that 40 years only refers to some of those technologies, not to the photovoltaics. I think in the paper. That's why I was kind of surprised by that. But in our paper, I actually have the actual lifetime we assume for photovoltaics. I think it was 30 years. So I don't think it was 40 years for the photovoltaics. I think it was just for the ethanol factories and maybe the CSP. I don't think it was for photovoltaics. Yeah, sorry to be a little bit confusing there.
Okay. So thank you for the clarification. Okay, so let's maybe go for other questions. One moment, please. Yep. So there is another question. So first of all, I would like to thank you for the presentation. Could you please give us brief information about the methodology that is preferred or adopted for calculation of the estimation of CO2 emissions and the estimation of water usage for each type of electricity?
Paper in environmental science and engineering. Sorry, energy and environmental science, which can be accessed from that website that I gave at the very last slide. It's not actually at that website, but there's a link to that website on that web page. So the paper called Review of Energy Solutions to Global Warming, Air Pollution, and Energy Security has all the details of how the CO2 emissions were associated for each energy type and how the water usage was calculated and all the references. So I'd suggest to go there, and there are spreadsheets, in fact, as in the appendix of that paper that show you all the calculations, so you can repeat the calculations yourself. I think that's the best way. Otherwise, there are too many technologies to discuss.
Of the presentation for all these assumptions. Very well. So next
and also
question.
send me an email if you can't find it directly, if you can't find the specific paper you want.
Okay, so thank you for the offer, Mark. So your email is in one of the boxes on the right columns. Okay, perfect. So we have another question. So Mark, if you have to leave in some time, you can indicate me. Otherwise, we can stay for 5 or 10 more minutes for questions.
Yeah, sure, I can stay.
Okay, excellent. So next question, is smart grid a factor?
No, it's not. The only things that are accounted for are conversion to electricity, and there's a slight some slight efficiency improvements in technologies are assumed, but not very much, just because we wanted to be conservative. But yeah, the smart grid was not a factor, so that could actually improve things a little more.
Okay. Thank you. Coming back to the previous comments on water use and emissions, we have two more questions. So, first, could you please let us know whether there are any studies that consider the amount of water usage for cleaning purposes?
Yeah, actually our study considered cleaning as well. And so there is, so that for example, for solar photovoltaics, some of that water is for cleaning. And so there are references to our numbers in that review paper. It's energy and environmental science paper again. And, I don't know if it's easier if I...
If you have it, you can type it in the introductions window, just on the right.
Okay, hold on a second. I can, on the right, there's there are a couple places where I can write, looks like I can write something. Would it be, oh, the introductions, okay.
Excellent.
Send, okay. Okay.
Good. Good, thank you. So, this
that's a link directly to that paper that has the water. So that paper should have references for water cleaning.
Good. So the other question related to this one is whether these studies focus as well on other emissions, not only CO2. So let's say a complete life cycle assessment.
Yes, and so again, in that paper, there are some studies depending on which technology you're interested in. For example, with coal with carbon capture, the IPCC 2005 report has a lot of information on other pollutants aside from CO2, and so that's also referenced in this paper I just sent a link for. For biofuels, I would suggest for like soy biodiesel and ethanol and corn ethanol, and cellulosic ethanol, it suggests Mark DeLucci's. He has a paper on his website that it's a long, it's about 90 pages, but it's also referenced in this paper that discusses the pollutant emissions from all these biofuels. So I would suggest that one because it has probably the most detail of any paper I've seen on that. And for other like wind or solar, I would have to dig into the literature temperature, and also I remember go back into my paper to see if there are reference papers on that. So I can't say off on right now. Give you some other suggestions.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we assume that all these questions related to emissions and environmental balance beyond that, Mark offers his email address just if you want to go further in depth. Very well, thank you. So we have another question: how to address international connectivity? How to address the sharing of the power? Thank you.
Yeah, so that gets into politics. And so politics is something that is always a problem sometimes. So certainly in Europe, the European Union is doing an okay job, and at least in planning, because I think the European Union now has a plan to go 80% renewable by 2050, and so there's cooperation is possible among states, among countries. Information is presented, and it's shown to be more efficient for cooperation to occur, then it's more likely that politicians will agree to this, especially when they see that it'll cost them less and it'll make their system more reliable. So I think the key in all of this is first of all having a unified voice in the scientific community and certainly in the in all communities, in the public as well, to have a unified voice saying this is what we want, and politicians will usually listen, particularly if there's a benefit to them. So being able to transmit the information and having a unified voice are two critical things. Just like anything, it's almost like you have to convince politicians that it's something good, and there has to be a benefit to be shown. So that can be provided by giving more information. And whereas right now what happens is there are so many different energy technologies competing for money that the politicians don't know who to believe.